Well, good evening, everyone. I think I'm about a minute ahead of schedule, but thought I just wanted to say good evening to all you and thanks for coming. This is really a great venue for a presentation that's got PowerPoint with this giant screen like this. I'm so excited to take advantage of this. I understand at least 3/4 of us were struggling with the steps. There's not too many people under 80 here right now.
Not quite that old.
Oh, not that bad.
Close, but not.
Yeah. Now, the lights will be about like they are right now, so the stairs are well lit heading out. So anybody be prepared to take anybody out on a stretcher that has to leave. Could be any one of us, right? So, are we good, Christopher? All right, let's get underway. I think it's about 6 o'clock. Let me tell you a little bit about how this presentation came about. Several months ago, I got to digging up county voting results for Lee County for the presidential elections. And it took a while. I had to go into all the newspapers. That's where I was getting most of the results, going back into the 1900s, into the early 1900s, and going back into the 1800s, and going all the way back to 1856 is where I went. And I was able to collect from usually the Dixon Evening Telegraph the vote totals for every presidential election in Lee County since then. So the question has been, has Lee County always been Republican? The short answer is yes. And if you want, you can go now. But wait, there's more. We're going to get into a lot of the details and slicing and dicing some of the data here in a few minutes. But I wanted to start with a story that I ran across in the Whiteside County history of 1877. This was by Charles Bent, who wrote that one in 1877. And he was telling about how they collected the election returns in 1836. Now it's hard to get history from the 1830s locally, but here was a story that Charles Bent, who was, I think he ended up being the editor of the Gazette. Anybody from Sterling here tonight? Any Sterlingites? Yes, okay, a couple of hands. So Charles Bent had written this, and he had this story from 1836, and I'll show it to you just verbatim. The returns were given to Solomon M. Seeley, the returns of the election of 1836. He was a boy, then 10 years of age, son of Colonel Seeley, and being mounted on an Indian pony, he was told to deliver those results to John Dixon at Dixon's Ferry, who would then put them in charge of the stage driver that would then go to Galena. See, this is how they had to do things in 1836. Get a 10-year-old boy, mount him on an Indian pony. I don't know what the significance of to an Indian pony, if it's even more reliable or less, I don't know, but there he's on an Indian pony, 10 years old. He's got the federal election results. Today they'd be in a Brinks truck, I suppose, but a 10-year-old kid, and he's off to John Dixon at Dixon's Ferry. He's going to put them in charge of the stage driver now, and they take them on up to Galena, and they'll get there a couple weeks later. Not that bad. But the story goes on. The distance to be traveled was 28 miles from Prophetstown to Dixon, with nothing to follow but an Indian trail and not a house on the route between Prophetstown and Dixon's Ferry. On reaching what was then known as the 9-mile run, 9 miles west of Dixon. Now, I don't know exactly what that is. It maybe is close to where the Hennepin Canal is now. Maybe some of you can help me with that later on. But the kid found it full and running over at that time. And remember, it's November of 1836. But having been told to place the returns into the hands of Uncle John Dixon, he knew it must be done. By the way, this reference to Uncle John, I don't know if he's Uncle John or maybe everybody called him Uncle John, but that's what it says in the history. The weather was cold. It's November. And it's freezing, and yet he boldly plunged his pony into the stream, and he had to swim across. He's got the election results probably in a leather satchel or something on his horse, but in they go into the water and swimming across. I don't know how horses cooperated with this, but they often did that back then. The story continues. Upon reaching Dixon's house, his clothes were frozen to his person, but by the motherly care of Mother Dixon, he was put in a proper condition to return home the next morning. That's the entire story here. There's no real punch to it, but it's just how they had to do things in 1836. Get a 10-year-old kid on an Indian pony and send him down 28 miles. And by the way, if you look at a map, this is an 1837 map. This is Prophetstown. This is the likely path he took along the Rock River to get up to Dixon's Ferry. Notice here, there is no Sterling here. There's no Rock Falls on this map. Now, there was a Sterling. There's a few houses in Sterling at that time, but there is no Rock Falls in 1836. No houses anywhere between Dixon and Prophetstown at that time. So, I don't know. I just found that story somewhat fascinating. But let's talk about how Lee County voted for president for every election since 1856. Now, I'm not going to go through every single year. Some of you would like that, but not all of you, so we'll just stick with the general results here. You might be wondering, well, why are we starting at 1856? Now, my friend Gary Brown, you know why we started at 1856, so let me tell you why. It's because of this guy. The Republican Party started in 1856. So some say it's actually 54, but for the presidential election, it was 56. It was John C. Fremont who was the first Republican candidate for president in that particular year. And that particular election was the first election in this country to pit a Republican candidate against a Democrat candidate. And it has stayed that way ever since. Every election, presidential election since 1856, there has been a Republican and a Democrat candidate running for president. Sometimes some other guys are in there as well, but that's why 1856 is so critically important here. But I need to have this important footnote here. Now, the Democratic Party of 1856 is not the Democratic Party of 2024. There's all kinds of changes that have taken place. The same way with the Republicans. The Republicans are not the same. They stand for different things. There are different hot issues that were hot back then that are no longer an issue anymore. Different hot issues that we have now today. So you can't compare the two, but what you can say emphatically that the Democratic Party, as it was called in 1856, is still called the Democratic Party. And there has been a continuous line of succession all the way through for both parties since 1856. But I wanted to say this first before I get in trouble later, because there's all kinds of ways that this presentation can go south in a hurry. So just making sure I get out of here alive, and I think we'll all be okay. So first, let's talk about the typical vote over that period of time from 1856 all the way up to 2020. Now, this is 164 years and 42 different presidential elections. Now, if you average up the percentages, this is what I'm going to present to you right now. The typical vote of Republicans versus the Democrats over that period of time. Again, the average Republican vote, let's say 55% of people went for the Republicans and 45% went to the Democrats. And if it stayed that way for 164 years, the average would be 55% to 45%. But the truth is, the average Republican vote versus the average Democratic vote is this. 62% over those 164 years have voted for the Republican candidate, and 35% over those 164 years have voted for the Democratic candidate. Now, things have changed, though, over the years. But let's look now at the typical vote for the first 8 elections, just to see what it was like back then. The first 8 elections from 1856 to 1884. What was the typical vote then? Well, then it was actually 64%. Even the Republicans had a little more at that time. and the Democrats had 36%. So this was the typical split you would see in the first 8 presidential elections in Lee County between the Republicans and the Democrats. This is the margin of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats for so many years back there in the 1800s. A difference of 28 percentage points between the two. A significant margin there. But now let's advance up to today. If you're to look at the last 8 elections between 1992, this would have been Clinton versus George H.W. Bush, and 2020, which was Trump and Biden. Those last 8 elections, what was the average Republican vote versus the average Democratic vote? Well, this is what it was. 53% typically voted Republican for those 8 elections, against 41% for the Democratic candidate of the last 8 elections. Okay, that's a big difference. The Democrats are making great headway now in local politics. If you change the dates, though, by using 1992 and 1996 becomes a problem because it was a split ticket, and that diluted the numbers for the Republican Party. So if I changed the numbers to 2000 to 2020 to give us a more accurate feel for the strength of the Republican Party and the strength of the Democratic Party right now, currently, at least in the last, 5 elections, 6 elections, whatever that is. So it's now 56% of the county typically votes Republican now in the presidential race versus 42%. This is a good picture of where we are now. In a typical vote, it's going to be 56% will go for the Republican candidate, 42% for the Democratic candidate. Okay? Now, so you're going to wonder, well, have the Republicans lost some strength over the years and have the Democrats gained some strength? Well, I think you already can tell that they have, but to look at it rather specifically, the Republicans, for the first 8 elections, they were at 64%, but now they're 56% for the last those years. They've dropped 8 percentage points over that time. Now the Democrats, then versus now, in the first 8 elections, they were at 36%. Now they're at 42% for the last several elections. So they have increased their vote totals by 6 percentage points. Not 6%, 6 percentage points. There's a difference there, which I won't get into the math on that. It'll just confuse everybody, including myself. All right. Now, if you want to look at just look at all the data and see who were the top 5 most popular Republican candidates since 1856. I mean, who gathered the most votes over that period of time? And I'm going to show you the top 5. Number 1 got 82% of Lee County's vote. 82% of all the people voting in Lee County voted for this guy. Now, you're going to think, right, that, well, of course, it's Ronald Reagan, right? It's not Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is not number 1 here. Who's who do you think? You want to guess?
Lincoln.
Lincoln is a guess?
Grant.
Grant is a guess? Eisenhower is a guess? Those are all good guesses. They're all wrong.
Warren Harding.
Yes, Gary knows. The answer is Warren Harding. Warren Harding in 1920. Folks were really fed up with Woodrow Wilson in these parts. He's this progressive guy, and they come off the rails, and this League of Nations stuff. Are you nuts? They were saying, and people were bailing out of support of Woodrow Wilson, and they were going for anybody else. And this is the guy they went to. Was he the governor of Ohio, Gary? Does that sound right? Senator. He ran against the governor of Ohio in that election in 1920. But the number 2 guy, the number 2 most popular Republican candidate in the history of Lee County is, of course, our friend Ronald Reagan in 1980. Yes, but 74%, this is 74.2%, 74.0% is the guy again. So he actually lost 2% of the vote between 1980 and 1984. There was a little loss in the strength of his support over that period of time. But now 73%, the fourth most popular Republican candidate is Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Back in 1904, just after McKinley was shot, and then Roosevelt took over and he ran, and he did very well. Local people loved Teddy Roosevelt. He was a big hero to them. And Eisenhower, some of you guessed Eisenhower, he's not far behind there at 72%. This is a big, big landslide in Lee County terms for Eisenhower. Eisenhower is kind of unique in that this was his, notice this is his second election. He ran in 1952. He actually had less percentage of the vote in 52. When he ran again, more people voted for it. The typical pattern with candidates that run twice is they start to lose a little strength. But Eisenhower bucked that. His strength actually increased from his first term to his second term. So that is the Republican candidates. If you want to look at a graph of the entire thing from 1856 all the way over to 2020, here's your big four up here. Teddy Roosevelt here in 1904. There's Warren Harding there in 1920. Eisenhower. And those two tall ones are both Eisenhower. And Reagan's even a little more, his 74.2 and his 74.0 percentage. We're going to talk about this thing pretty soon, and those things over there to describe what was going on. By the way, this black line is the 50% line. They're almost always getting more than 50% of the total vote in Lee County, but there's 3 times when they did not get 50% of the vote. We'll talk about those in a minute. Let's talk about the most popular Democratic candidates over that entire span of time. Now, the most popular Democratic candidate in Lee County got 48% of the vote. Who do you think that was? FDR?
Stephen Douglas.
Stephen Douglas? Kennedy? FDR, you're the winner, Bubba. Yes, Roosevelt got 48% of the vote in 1932, which is the first time he ran. Interesting thing about FDR, his local support plummeted for the next 3 elections. It dropped way down by the time of his 1944 election. Amazing. So folks were really fed up with him in the local area. But he started off with a real strong showing. 48%. It's the most that any Democratic candidate for president has ever gotten in Lee County. 48%. Number 2 is Obama in 2008 when he first ran then. It's just a less than a percentage point between these two, but FDR is number 1. Down at 47% was LBJ. Now, in 1964, what's happening there, of course, JFK had just been assassinated in 63, and there is this groundswell of compassion and support for the Democratic candidates there, and LBJ runs in on that wave and gets a good amount of support locally, the 3rd most in the history of this county. 45% is Obama. Again, the second time he runs, he's losing some of his strength. He lost 3 percentage points over those 4 years, but he's also number 4 out of 5. And the last one is Grover Cleveland. Back in 1884, he garnered 44% of the Lee County vote in that year. Of course, Cleveland ran a total of 3 times. 3 times. This was his best showing in Lee County in 1884. So let's go on now and look at this whole graph of this is the Democratic candidate vote totals in Lee County. There's your top 4 there, Obama and FDR and Johnson. And then you've got all these some real bloops down here that are below. This is the 30% line here, shooting all the way over. 50% is up there, that black line. So they've never gotten more than 50% of the vote in Lee County yet. But as you can tell, if you compare what's going on down here with what's going on over there, there's a growing strength for the Democratic Party vote in Lee County over time. Now, we talked about the top 5 most popular. How about the bottom 5 least popular presidential candidates in Lee County? I thought this might be of interest to you. One candidate only got 25% of the vote for Lee County. A Republican candidate for president. You want to guess who that might be? Hoover? Hoover is on the top 5. You may not get this. This is, well, let me just show you. It is Taft. William Howard Taft back in 1912. Why? Well, because there was a split ticket there. Teddy Roosevelt did not run as a Republican that year. Is that right, Gary? He ran as the Bull Moose Party, and he got all the results for a lot of the Republicans, and the Republican candidate didn't get very many at all. George H.W. Bush was the second to the worst turnout for Lee County vote, getting 43% of the vote. Bob Dole, shortly after that, gets 47%. 52% went for John McCain. These are the bottom 5. The bottom 5 of all the candidates over the last 42 elections. And then there is your man, Herbert Hoover, 19 and 32. Looking at the Republican totals, yeah, here's the split ticket vote. The Bull Moose Party explaining what's going on here for the Republicans. And Ross Perot kind of really messed things up for the Republicans in that year, which was, 1992. And this is Ross Perot ran again in 1996, and he really messed up Bob Dole's chances of being elected. So those are the 3 years that the Republicans had a candidate who got less than 50% of the Lee County vote. There would have been somebody else on the ticket that took some of their strength away. But who were the 5 bottom Democratic candidates? The worst vote totals in Lee County? One of them got 18%, and that was Cox. What's his first name, Gary?
James Middleton Cox.
James Middleton Cox. 1920, he ran against Warren G. Harding, and Harding got the 82%. Remember, Cox is not doing so well. He gets the other 18% of the vote. The next worst was, what's Davis's first name?
John W.
John W. Davis in 1924 ran against Coolidge, right? All right.
Yes.
In 1980, Jimmy Carter did not do that well in Lee County. He had the 3rd worst turnout in Lee County, worst vote total in Lee County of anybody in the history. 21%, only 21% of Lee Countyans voted for Jimmy Carter in 1980. Well, what the other factor there is what? Reagan, right, because Reagan had enormous support. Walter Mondale suffered the same problem. The Reagan factor also hurt his numbers in Lee County, and then 27% went for, is it Alvin Parker? Alton Parker in 1904, and he ran against Roosevelt. Teddy?
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the 5 worst, not that they were bad candidates, but they're the 5 worst turnouts in Lee County for these particular candidates. Now, if you look again at the entire graph from start to finish, here's Parker, there's Cox, there's Davis. I wanted to point out this one here. This is Adlai Stevenson in 1952 here. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower runs for president, and he's enormously popular here in Illinois. The interesting thing about the Adlai Stevenson candidacy, he had previously been governor of Illinois in 1952. But he runs for president now in 1950. I said 52. Well, he had been governor in 1952, but when he ran for president in 52, he's running, let me get this straight now. When he leaves the governorship of the state of Illinois, his lieutenant governor runs for governor in Illinois. And his name is
Dixon.
Sherwood Dixon. Sherwood Dixon, which is Jim Dixon's father, as well as Henry Dixon's father and all the other Dixons. But it was not a good year for the Democrats. Eisenhower's enormously popular. Stevenson was trounced on the national level, and locally it was not good for Sherwood Dixon either running for governor in 1952 because everything was going Republicans then. People were tired of what had been, 6 straight Democratic presidential administrations under FDR and then Truman, or maybe that number's not quite right. But then so they went for the Republican candidate, and Stevenson did not do well in either of those years. He ran again in 56, but he's against Eisenhower, whose popularity is even increasing over the term of his administration. So let's talk about the most popular Republican candidates who lost. They were most popular in Lee County, but yet they lost the general election anyway. And I just have 2 to show you here. One got 70% of the vote in Lee County and yet still lost the general election nationally, and that was Charles Evans Hughes in 1916. He ran against Woodrow Wilson, and yet he does not make it to the presidency. The other guy is Thomas E. Dewey in 1944, running with 68% of the vote totals in Lee County, yet he does not win the presidential election. He runs again in 48 against Truman. And remember, that's when Truman holds up the Chicago Tribune that says Dewey defeats Truman. Yeah. Well, he didn't. That was a little premature of the Tribune to put that out. So those are the 2 most popular Republican candidates who ended up losing the election on a national level. Now the most popular Democrats who lost the election. We're shifting now to Democratic candidates. They were popular here in Lee County, but they ended up losing on the national level. They got 42% and 40%. The 42% guy was Al Gore, just back in 2000. And the 40% guy was John Kerry, just in 2004, just 4 years later than Gore. We all remember these 2, but they did relatively well in Lee County, and yet they lost the national election. I just thought that as far as presidential trivia goes, this is something to stick in the back of your head and throw to the wastebasket. So why though? Why was Lee County so Republican back in the 1800s? If it's 63% versus 30-something back then in the 1800s, why?
Lincoln.
Slavery.
Lincoln? Slavery? What else?
New England.
New England. Okay.
This was settled by people from the north, not from the south.
You're stealing all my thunder, Gary. Well, let's look at it. I've got, I think, 4 different answers to this question. Why Lee County was so Republican back in the 1800s. The first reason is this guy, Father John Dixon. Now, this is maybe a stretch, but just hear me out on this one. Father John Dixon's the first guy in Dixon. He arrives in April of 1830. There's nobody else here. Nobody else. For 60 miles in almost any direction, he's the only person, him and his family. Everybody who stopped in Dixon to stay knew John Dixon. And John Dixon, even though he was very open to anybody for the rest of his life, he's loved by everybody, yet he had some very distinct and definite political opinions at the time. And he was Republican. He was known to be a lifelong abolitionist. He was against slavery even before he left New York back in 1820. And at the 1856 Bloomington Convention in Illinois, where the Republican Party in this state was launched, he was honored there. He was already there as a delegate. There's even the Dixon Sun in 1856 published a story on the front page of the Dixon Sun in 1856 that said John Dixon was elected the president of the Bloomington Convention. Unfortunately, Jim Dixon has looked this up, and he couldn't find any verification of this report by the Dixon Sun. But he was that well-known statewide in Republican politics, so that he would be a central figure who was called out and honored at the 1856 Bloomington Convention. First time there's a Republican convention in the state of Illinois. That's also the first year that there is a Republican presidential candidate, 1856. But there's more about John Dixon. I ran across this quote from E.B. Washburn. E.B. Washburn was an attorney who had to travel between Galena and Springfield back in the 1830s and 40s. And all the time he's taking the stagecoach and he's stopping at the river at Dixon. And he's got to get across on John Dixon's ferry and go across. He'd almost always stay with John and Rebecca Dixon at his house there. And they got to be good friends because every time he would go up to Galena or go down to Springfield, he'd be staying with John Dixon. And he writes this letter to John Dixon in 1874, many years later, and he says this: "In the field of politics, I have known you so well, first as a Whig, like myself, and then as a Republican. I can never forget what a true personal and political friend you've been to me always. You scarcely ever fail to attend congressional conventions and always an unswerving supporter." Now, this is what E.B. Washburn said of John Dixon. E.B. Washburn, by the way, ended up being the Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration in Washington, D.C. I think he ended up being an ambassador to maybe France or something, I forget which. But he was a big name in American politics, but he knew John Dixon from way back, and they were good friends. But he remembers him as a Republican, and they were both Republicans. They talk about this. He went to the congressional conventions in Illinois as well. So that's John Dixon factor. A second factor is this: the migration from the Northeast. And Gary nailed this one right on the head here. Where did all these Countians come from? Well, largely they're coming from over there in the Northeast and coming over this way. Some went down to the Ohio River and then come up this way. Like my grandparents, my great-great-great-grandparents in 1845, they came from Maryland, which is somewhere on this map. Where I'm too close to it. Way down here, okay. Here's Baltimore. He went up to the Ohio River, came down the Ohio River. This is my great-grandparents. And they came up the Mississippi and then went up the Illinois River. And they got off the river at Peru and then took the west of the way to Dixon Overland in 1845. But so many people came from out northeast to Dixon and Lee County in those early years. You might say, how do we know that? Good question. Well, we know that because of this old settler record, which is found in the 1880 History of Dixon and Palmyra. They've republished this a few times. How many of you might have a copy of the 1880 History of Dixon and Palmyra? Anybody? Really? I thought there'd be a few of you that would have this, but I should be selling copies tonight. It's really kind of cool. It's got some very old history in it that's not found anywhere else. But there's 6 or 7 pages in this thing that has this old settler record. By 1880, when this was written, the local people had such reverence for the old settlers, the pioneers who endured such great privations, as they said back then, all the hardships that they had to endure in coming overland and dealing with the Indians, and no bridges and no nothing, just a tough time. And so they actually listed them off one by one in this book by name and almost in alphabetical order. There's Alexander, followed by Ayres, followed by Armstrong, then back to Aldrich, and then Atkinson, Ames. But they're all the A's are there. You get the idea. They're not going to reset the typing. Get this thing. But they're all right there, and they listed where they came from, whether it's a state or a country, the year they came, the year of their birth, and some remarks about them. But all this is there for over 500 of the old settlers to the Lee County area. And that's how we know how many people came and when they came and from whence they came. Well, if we want to look at when they arrived, I went through this list of 500 some and identified the years that they came. There's only 29 people came to Lee County in the early 1830s. In the second half of the 1830s, that's when this great migration took place. And if you've ever heard of this great migration as applied to this neck of the woods, this is when it took place, in 1835 to 1839. I found some newspaper articles published out east in 1835, 1836, 1837, where talked about the Rock River Valley being this fabulous place, the beautiful scenery, the rich soil. And this was inspiring people to leave it all behind and come to Lee County to experience what we have here. And they continued to come in 1840 to 44, 45 to 50 here. So, but the majority of them are right here. So the real question is, where are they coming from, and how would that influence their the politics of Lee County? Well, where did they come from? The top 6 states I'm going to show you. What do you think is the most popular state where people came from to plant their roots in Illinois?
New York.
Come on, you guys know way too much. How did you know it was New York? Maybe that's where John Dixon came from. I kind of let that out a little bit. Pennsylvania is number 2. These are the 2 big ones right there. And then it drops off considerably. New Hampshire, Ohio, Kentucky, and Maine. These are way down the list. But notice where these states are. They're up there in the general northeast. Not totally New England, but north. Kentucky would be the only one that doesn't really fit with the rest of these states. And these states were known to be bastions for the early Republican Party back in the 1850s and 60s. Yeah, being strongly anti-slavery in these states, the Northeast became the bedrock for the emerging Republican Party. And these are the people, by and large, who are coming to Lee County, thus beginning this majority of Republicans in this particular county. I thought that was at least an interesting point. As I was going through all the history and stuff, I ran across a list of some notable Democrats and notable Republicans who were here back at that time. And I thought it was worth just showing them to you. One is Judge John Eustace. You've heard of Eustace Drive in Dixon, right? Well, this is named after him. He ended up being the Democratic candidate for Illinois Attorney General in 1876. He was well known as a Democrat, but well liked in town. William Barge, I don't know if you know this name at all. He was an attorney. He ended up writing a history of Lee County in 1918, I believe it was. William Barge ended up marrying the granddaughter of Father John Dixon. So there's a connection there. He also goes in, there's a law firm, Eustace, Barge, and Dixon. All 3 of these guys were Democrats. This is Sherwood Dixon, who ended up being the chairman of the Democratic Party in Lee County back in those days. This is way back now in the late 1800s when this is taking place. There's another Sherwood Dixon later on that I mentioned in 1952. Don't confuse those 2, but they are directly related in the direct same line. He's a grandson or great-grandson of Father John Dixon. Judge James Charters, his father was Governor Alexander Charters. He wasn't really the governor, but they always called him governor, and he owned Hazelwood, or the Walgreen estate. The Walgreen estate, as we know today, was owned by the Charters family, and Judge James Charters is one of those. Then William Van Epps. There's a Van Epps Avenue in Dixon on the south side, I believe. He was a candidate for lieutenant governor of the state in 1868, but all these guys were prominent Democrats whose names you might recognize for various reasons. But who were some of the notable Republicans in the county? You may have heard of Everett Avenue, Everett Street in Dixon. Dr. Oliver Everett, close friend of John Dixon. Henry Dement. You heard of Dement Town and Dement Avenue and all that stuff? That's really actually named after Henry's father, John Dement. But Henry himself became quite well known. He was elected Illinois Secretary of State, and he served for 8 years, from 1880 to 1888. J.C. Ayers was president of the Dixon National Bank back in its early years. Judge John Crabtree, and Ben Shaw, the editor of the Telegraph. So my point here is that where did all these guys come from? They came from the Northeast, and there was largely, for most of them, would have been identifying with the Republican Party. And we're answering the question now, just to remind you where we are, why Lee County was so Republican back in that era. Well, let's talk about this guy here, because he becomes reason number 3, and he might be the number 1 reason why Lee County has been so Republican, and that is this: the Telegraph. The Telegraph. Back then, in the 1800s, newspapers were frequently and usually very open about being pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. They made no bones about it. They would frequently make fun of the opposing candidate, whoever it is, and be giving free airtime to their guy. And Ben Shaw of the Telegraph was no different there. He's just like anybody else in the country. He was strong Republican in this area. Let's talk about the Telegraph a bit. This is a copy of the Telegraph. It came out, look at the date here, May 1st of 1851. This is the Dixon Telegraph and Lee County Herald. So always from the beginning, the idea and the intention was for the Telegraph to have a county-wide influence. And this newspaper has survived now for a very long time. 175th anniversary will be coming up here in a couple of years. That'll be a big one for the Telegraph. And it has, think about that, about the influence that they would have on people in Lee County. Now, it's true that there were as many as 13 competitive newspapers over the years in Lee County, but this is the one that survived. This is the one that's been dominant in all of our lives, right, in Lee County, and they have always been pro-Republican. Now, it's also true that in more recent years, they are not as open with their pro-Republican stance as they used to be back in the 1800s. But back then, in the 1800s, this would have had a significant influence on anybody walking through Lee County. Ben Shaw himself, he's got an interesting history. He began at the Telegraph that first year in 1851. He later buys it out and becomes the publisher. He also bought another paper in Lee County called the Dixon Republican, and he merged them together. For a while, it was called the Dixon Telegraph and Republican. He helped establish the Republican Party in Illinois in 1856. You know, with that Bloomington Convention I talked about? Yeah, Ben Shaw was involved with that. He also was elected circuit clerk and recorder in 1860, and he didn't die until 1909. So think of that. Over 50 years, he's involved as the editor and publisher of the Telegraph. Every day or every week, depending on whether it's a weekly or a daily, he's cranking out pro-Republican propaganda, which will tend to influence the county. Make sense? You may not like it, but that's what's been true with virtually any newspaper anywhere in the country. This is an actual image of a page in the Telegraph in 1856 here, July. Notice the big ad down here for John C. Fremont. Remember that? I mentioned he was the very first Republican candidate for president. Well, you know, Ben Shaw is publishing for free a big ad for John C. Fremont. He's openly supporting him and promoting him to all his readers of the Dixon Telegraph. Ben Shaw, editor. The evidence is right there that he's being that open about his promoting of a particular candidate. Not unusual. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it's the way it was, and it's the way it is in many counties around the country. So let's talk about the factor number 4. And I think, Mac, you mentioned Lincoln being a significant factor of why Lee County is so Republican. Now, I don't think this is a stretch to say that Lincoln had a big effect, but I think it makes sense. Let me describe why. You may have seen this rock before on the Lee County Courthouse lawn. Abraham Lincoln stumped for Fremont on the Lee County Courthouse lawn in July of 1856, which is what this rock says. You see back there, there's the Nachusa House, there's the post house there, that's the courthouse. You see where we are now, right? This says, Lincoln stood here while delivering his great speech, July 17, 1856, erected by the Dixon Post of the GAR in August of 1903. But so this is even 50 years after Lincoln delivers the speech. But we wanted to have a rock there to mark the spot where Lincoln stood. The strong feelings for Lincoln in this area persisted throughout the decades. Lincoln one time visited Governor Charters at Hazelwood. I mentioned Hazelwood a little while ago. Lincoln was out there, reportedly. He also stayed at the Nachusa House. There's a Lincoln room there, is there not, at the Nachusa House? I've not seen this. Have you seen this before? The Lincoln room at the Nachusa House? Anybody? No? None of us have been in that place. That's so kind of amazing. All right, well, it's there, so I'm told. And he also spoke in Sterling. He spoke in Polo. He spoke in Oregon. Lincoln's all over this place here, and the fond memories of Lincoln in this area go on and on. In 1858, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he speaks at Freeport and Ottawa, which is not too far from here, both those locations for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. On his way to Freeport, he stops in Amboy and delivers a speech there. That's in Lee County. He was friends with guys like Silas Noble, Joseph Crawford, and Judge Eustis. I mentioned Eustis earlier. You've heard of Crawford Avenue, right? And then Silas Noble built this beautiful estate out on North Brenton, which we call it now North Brenton. It used to be called the Morris Farm. That Silas Noble built that in 1856, something like that. And it's now known as the Kitzman Farm. The Kitzmans, you know that, up on North Brenton? Anyway, he was big friends with all these guys. Lincoln was, with these people in Dixon, was known to even stop at their houses at a time or two. And of course, when he was assassinated in 1865, this sparked this posthumous glorification. You know, prior to him being assassinated, he had been pilloried in the media frequently, making fun of this guy. He had rancorous periods with his own cabinet throughout his administration. But then as soon as he's assassinated, wow, Lincoln becomes like a god, almost mythical status. But here in Lee County, that mythical status was attained and still is retained to this date, I think. We have the Lincoln Highway that goes through this area, 1920. We have the Lincoln Statue. You see this picture of it here. On Lincoln Statue Drive, the Lincoln Avenue we have in Dixon. We also have Lincoln Way, which used to be West Fellows. They changed West Fellows to Lincoln Way back when the Lincoln Highway came through town. And we also have Lincoln School, erected in 1937. Why are we naming all this stuff after this guy? Well, Lee Countyans loved Abraham Lincoln, as did just about everybody in the country, but particularly around here because we had all these local connections. So let's summarize what I think are 4 reasons why Lee County has always been so Republican. Father John Dixon, migration from the Northeast, the Telegraph, and the Lincoln effect. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm just curious what you're thinking. I want you to vote for one of these 4 as probably being the most influential in Lee County being Republican. I'm going to ask one at a time. I want you to raise your hand if you think that's the most one. Number 1, Father John Dixon. Do you think he is the strongest factor of these 4? Raise your hand. Okay. 3 hands are going up. Remember that. Migration from the Northeast. How many think that's the most significant factor? I'm counting maybe 10 hands going up there. The Dixon Telegraph. About 20 hands there. And the Lincoln effect. There's a half a dozen hands there, okay? So migration from the Northeast is holding up strong, as well as the Dixon Evening Telegraph, probably number 1 there, if I remember. Right? Is that what you said? The Telegraph was the most popular one you said. I think that makes sense, doesn't it? But anymore, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see the Telegraph being so openly political anymore. Jeff, you would know, right? You don't see it anymore, do you? No.
I don't see it being much of anything.
Careful. Believe me, they're trying their best. They've got a great local history columnist anymore. So anyway, those are the 4 reasons why Lee County has been or was Republican back in the 1800s. But that doesn't answer the question. Why are they still so Republican? Why are they still so Republican? Now you think all the people who were alive when Lincoln was alive have been dead for 100 years. But yet we're still Republican? You think that as new baby is born in the year 1900, that child would grow up and they'd begin to analyze all the political issues of jobs and the economy and foreign policy, and they'd come up with their own idea as to who they're going to support. It's never that way, I don't think. No, something else is affecting the way we vote. Why is Lee County still so Republican? Just wondering. And I have two guesses here. Two guesses, and you may have some of your own that make a whole lot more sense than mine. Number one is the rural effect. The rural effect. I think if you look at political maps across the country, the red and blue stuff, this is a county by county map. The red are Republican and the blue are counties that went for the Democratic candidate back in 2020. I think this is a 2020 map. But look, there's Chicago there, there's New York City, Boston, they're all blue if it's largely populated on the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, blue, but right through the guts of the country, the Corn Belt and Nebraska, North Dakota, etc., it's all red. So today, rural folks tend to vote Republican. Now, I kind of always thought that this was always the case, but I was actually had to be corrected about that, because back in the 1800s, there were a lot of cities that were strongly Republican, but it's not so much true anymore. Can you think of a single city that has more than 1 million in population that's voting Republican routinely? Well, neither can I. We're even. So the rural-urban factor seems to be driving people's political proclivities anymore. Rural. Now, if you look, this is a national map, but let's look at the state map. This map is a little bit better. This is not county by county. Those can be a little bit deceiving. This is precinct by precinct in the state of Illinois. Blue, again, represents Democratic counties, counties that went either, if it's light blue, it went somewhat Democrat. If it's dark blue, it went really Democrat. And same way with light red and dark red. But you see this massive sea of red in all these precincts in Illinois, but it's rural. Looking at these, at this, St. Louis, right? What's that right there? Springfield. What's that? Champaign. Bloomington. Peoria. All right, and there's, of course, Chicago and Rockford and the Quad Cities, a little bit these little blue blips, only in the big cities. And so this is what we're seeing now, even on a national level. It's the larger populations that tend to vote Democratic, and it's the rural areas that tend to vote Republican. And this being a rural area, I think this is one of the reasons why the Republican Party is still strong in this area. That's the rural effect. Now, the only other effect that I wanted to share with you is what I call the parent effect. And that's a picture of dear old Dad right there. That's my dad. Because the question is this. Do you vote the way you vote because that's where your parents voted? I'm gonna make an actually official question out of this in a minute. But let me tell you my story. I remember when I first voted. I think I needed to be 21. So it might have been the Carter-Ford election in 1976, and I was going to go to vote, do my civic duty, and frankly, I had paid zero attention to politics up to that point in my life. I had no idea what the difference was between a Republican and a Democrat. And I went to dear old Dad and said, Dad, am I a Republican or a Democrat? Oh, you're a Republican, of course. He didn't put it that way, but he explained the difference, and he certainly made me feel free to vote any way I wanted to, but he explained why Republicans are Republicans, and et cetera, et cetera. But he did also explain that you come from a long line of Republicans in the Wadsworth family. But so the question is, did you first vote the way dear old Dad voted? Let me show you a couple of studies first off. There, 60 to 80% of people tend to align politically with their parents. There's a couple of good studies out that show that this is really a major factor, what your parents did. And specifically, dear old Dad. Fathers tend to have a stronger influence on one's political proclivities. And there's a couple of studies that support that idea. So my question for you, and I really want to know, and I don't care whether you're voting Republican or Democrat, doesn't make a difference, but number one, raise your hand if you know how your parents used to vote. Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up. Now, keep your hand up if you also vote the same way that your parents voted. Okay. Now, how many, now put your hands down. Now raise your hand if you're somebody who's voting the opposite of the way your parents did. Mick and Daryl, that's it? Wow. Okay, there's a couple of you. So, wow. Isn't that interesting? I wasn't sure I'd get quite a result like that. Now, sometimes if you don't have a very good relationship with your parents, sometimes you're going to vote the opposite the way they did, just to spite them. There's all kinds of motivations that can work into all this, but parental effect is what I'm calling it here. The parent effect on voting. So there's rural and the parent thing. And so
our parents were rural.
your parents are rural, so you got the double whammy on you. Yeah.
Mine were the opposite. My family, my grandfather, my father, and the family were all factory workers, strong Democrats. My grandma and grandpa had a picture of Roosevelt along with Jesus Christ in their living room. But when I grew up, and then I became more involved with other men who were business people, and I found out there's the rest of the world out there.
Okay, I get it. So you voted differently than the way your dad did,
Yes.
and your grandparents even.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned grandparents. I mentioned my great-great-great-grandfather, Christopher Wadsworth, who came here in 1845. Well, there's a little biography of him in one of the county histories published in 1890 or something, and it said that he was a Democrat. So somewhere along the Wadsworth line, somebody switched, and now most of the Wadsworths, I suspect, are voting Republican. Now, I've talked to Jim Dixon. I suppose he wouldn't mind me mentioning this, but Father John Dixon was Republican. But by the time his grandson comes along, Sherwood Dixon, he's a strong Democrat and chairman of the Democratic Party. And for the most part, the Dixon family has voted Democrat ever since. So there was a change somewhere along the line, but there's so many issues that can affect that through the years. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wondered if anybody else comes from a background like I do, where your mom and dad don't vote the same party. Yeah. For as long as I can remember, my mom and dad always voted one side to the other. It was always, one was Republican, one was Democrat.
Very good. Anybody else have a sort of a broken home in this regard? Yeah, there's a couple of you, but generally that doesn't happen. So Bill, right?
Yes.
I recognize your voice, but I can't see your face.
They're both still alive and they're both still living and they're married.
They're still married, even. How about that? So did you end up identifying more with Dad's political party or Mom's?
I started with Dad and I ended with Mom.
How about that? Why do you suppose that is?
So, I mean, if you want to get into the deep politics.
No, you can always family problems, skeletons in the closet. Oh my gosh. We can talk later anyway, but that's interesting. So these two strong factors, the fact that we live in a rural area, not an urban one, and the way the thinking goes in this urban-rural thing is, if you live in a city, you're crowded with people. You are forced into all different kinds of people. You're forced to just get along with everybody. There's different priorities or different problems in an urban environment than there is in a rural environment. One is not better than the other. One is not worse than the other. They just are different, and they tend to produce different folks. I know There's like one family friend who was a friend of my kids who came from a Republican family, growing up in Dixon, after all, right? They ended up moving to Chicago and being a part of this urban environment for the last 20 years, and she's now a strong Democrat. I bet there are, how many of you would say that you have a child who grew up one way, then moved off to a city and switched parties? Yes, so not too many, but there's a few of you. Do you still talk? Of course you do. I should hope so. So, but this brings me to a final point. This is more, here's where you get 3 minutes of a sermon. See, how do you survive this polarized culture that we live in today? I know this topic is really sensitive, and some of us are even sitting on eggshells as we listen to what I'm saying. I get it. And it's hard to even raise political topics when you're talking with friends anymore because you just don't know how bad that's going to turn out. So we live in this polarized culture, which is much worse, I suspect, than it ever was in my lifetime. And I suspect it was much worse than it was even back in the 1800s. So how do you survive this? Now, I'm not a political scientist. That's not my field. My field is New Testament. And I ran across a couple of verses that actually helped me personally to be able to survive and have some sort of sanity and calm in the midst of this political environment we live in. And one comes from the Apostle Paul. It's in Romans 15. He's talking to a situation here where there's differences of opinions on the issue of holy days. And people are going at it. And the one piece of advice he says to them is, let everyone be fully convinced in their own mind. He doesn't tell one of them that you're wrong and you need to shut up, or the other one that you're right and you should run things. He says to both of them, be fully convinced in your own mind. Study it through, whatever the issue is, best as you can. Come to your own conclusions, but be fully convinced in your own mind. And you can't control what somebody else is thinking. Everybody is going to think a little bit differently as they process any given issue. Be fully convinced in your own mind. But he has a second thing he says for this same situation. Just a few verses later, he says, let's not judge one another anymore. And that's what was going on there. The people who were in favor of holy days were criticizing the people who were against them and all this stuff. Stop judging each other. He actually says, who are you to judge the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls. So get off his back. That's my own translation of what's going on in Romans 14. This is another thing that was very liberating for me when I realized I'm not the judge. Matter of fact, I don't want to be the judge. Somebody's already got the job of being the judge, and it ain't me. That's good news. I don't have to sit in judgment of anybody else anymore. Let God take care of that. If somebody else is going to come to a different position, even on a political issue or a religious issue, whatever it is, be fully convinced in your own mind, and then let's stop judging one another. I don't know if that means anything to you, but that meant a lot to me to finally be able to make it through yet another campaign season. We've got 3 weeks left until this nightmare is over again, and we finally have an election and a new candidate and a new president. I don't know how this is going to end up, but we all need to just chill out and just get used to the fact whoever's going to be president is going to be president for 4 years. More than likely, it's not going to change a thing. But just get over it. Turn off Fox News and CNN. Stop watching that stuff that just lets your blood pressure boil. And let's get back to living life. Almost everybody in this room is over 70 like me. I've just got a few years left. I don't want to live my life with so much turmoil and angst anymore. That, my friends, is my best guess of why Lee County has always been Republican. So you have questions, comments on what we've got here? Anybody? Yes?
I have one question about the maps. When you show a solid red map of Republican
Yeah.
and the blue little cities. If you look at California, or let's look at Montana. Montana is almost solid red.
Yeah.
And yet, the population in Montana that I've read, there are 3 counties in California that have that same number of population. So when you see that solid red, a lot of that is farmland and fields, and to me it doesn't give a depiction of the population that are Democrats, the population that are Republicans necessarily, because you see a sea of red and it looks like that solid Republican.
Yeah. And it could be that there's only 5 people in that county, 3 of them voted Republican and 2 of them voted Democrat, yet it gets to be red. People have criticized these county maps as being a little bit distorted. This is a precinct by precinct map, which is a little more accurate in depicting what's going on, but still these county by county maps have that problem, and you've, I think, adequately described it. So when you see that sea of red throughout the country, it seems so like, why do we have a Democratic president when there's a sea of red throughout the country? Well, each one of those red dots could represent 50 people, and a blue dot represents 50 million. That's an exaggeration, but yeah. Yeah, Daryl.
Wasn't it a few years ago for, I think it was governor, that there's 102 counties in the state, and 100 of them voted Republican, and 2 voted Democrat, but the Democrat won because of Chicago, Cook County, and a county down by St. Louis.
Yeah.
St. Louis.
I think you heard that, didn't you? This is the thing we have in Lee County. Chicago is the tail wagging the dog. They've got way more people than the rest of the entire state. And so the way Chicago goes is the way Illinois is going to go. And I've recognized for a long time, my vote, for president anyway, doesn't make a difference.
When you look at the country and you see all that, that's exactly why we need the Electoral College. Because if you don't, those blue dots are going to dominate. And all those red areas are going to mean nothing without the Electoral College.
Yeah. The old argument for the Electoral College. Yeah, I've seen that before. Other questions, comments? Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry.
hold on, Gary. Go ahead, Bill.
Was there ever a Democratic leaning newspaper in the area? Not necessarily even Lee County, but say Oregon or Sterling, or was there ever a Democratic leaning newspaper in our area?
There were at least 2 in Lee County, but they were all gone within a few years.
Very short lifespan.
What's that?
They had a very short lifespan.
Yes, they did. But almost anybody competing against the Telegraph had a short lifespan. There was the Dixon Sun for a while, the Dixon Daily Star, but they didn't last very long. It's old Ben Shaw knew how to run a paper. And it really is a remarkable thing. And the whole Shaw media thing is a remarkable thing. I actually hope that they survive and do extremely well. Obviously, they're down to bare bones staff anymore, doing their best to still report what they can with the staff that they got, with the loss of income that they've suffered, mostly due to the internet. Not so much any fault of their own, but it's due to the changing media landscape. So it's a tough deal. You had a question, Gary?
I was just wondering how they determine the election by just one state. They say, well, if they lose Pennsylvania, whether they're going to lose. How do they determine that?
Because I think they already know how, they have a good idea how, let's say, 45 states are going to vote. They already know. And so and they already know how many electoral votes are in all of those states that are already pretty much determined. And so it's going to come down to these few swing states that could go either way. And once, let's say Pennsylvania has, 50 electoral votes or something, one extra vote in Pennsylvania is going to win all 50 electoral votes, which could switch the whole election. And this has been going on for years and years and years. The same dynamic. Nothing's changed there. We all saw in the Bush-Gore election of 2000, when they're down to studying the Chads in Florida and all that stuff, it all came down to that one state. And who's going to get those 25 electoral votes from Florida? And It had to count every ballot again, and that's how that happened. So that's how that goes on. Bill?
I got a whole list, but I'm just gonna ask a couple, because I'll get with you later. But I was wondering, and you might not know this, but how many times did Lee County get it right on the national level?
Yeah. How many times did Lee County vote the same way the national vote went?
Yeah.
Usually that happens, but there's many cases when we did not. Obviously, when John C. Fremont ran, the Republicans didn't win that year. When Blaine ran, Hughes, Charles Evans Hughes, we talked about him. Alf Landon, Wendell Willkie, Thomas E. Dewey, Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, there's several, Bob Dole and McCain and Romney, and Trump lost last time. So I would guess that.
That's 11 that you were just named off.
Yeah, so 11 out of the last 42. So they get it right maybe 3/4 of the time. There's some counties in America that have this remarkable distinction that the way that county goes is the way the country goes. Lee County is not that county. But I've sometimes I used to cover the elections for WSDR back in the 1980s. I would be in the Lee County Courthouse, back in where the machines are going, spitting out all the results and analyzing these things first and then reporting them on the air. And I remember back then trying to come up with a model where we could maybe project how the national vote's going to go depending on how Lee County goes. But none of my models worked. I was just pie in the sky dreaming. Other questions? There's another hand, wasn't there somewhere? Anything? Yes, go ahead.
You talked about the Republican percentage coming down, Democrat going up last couple of times. Any idea why? One would be nobody reads the newspapers anymore. I know you're a columnist, but the young people don't read the newspaper, so they're not being influenced by shop media as much. Or any other ideas of why that's happening?
So your question is why you see this? Let me go to one of those bar charts. I think those are what we want to look at. Not that one. Almost there. Well, let's go back to this Republican one. This one. Are you talking about, like, why is there this difference between this and this? Is that the question?
Well, the question is, it sounded like the percentage of Republican votes were higher and the Democrats were lower, but in the last couple of elections, that's switching a little bit. So the Republican percentage is coming down, right?
Yeah.
And Democrat going up a little bit?
I think there's, let's put it this way, this is very general terms. This is the 50% mark right here. Typically, the Republicans can count on, for sure, let's say 48 to 50% of the vote always, if people are going to vote Republican. But then there's this wiggle room. There's a whole bunch of people in the county that are sometimes described as soft Republicans or soft Democrats that might go either way, and those are the folks that we're going to swing an election. They're the ones who are still waiting and listening right up until Election Day to figure out how they're going to vote, and that's going to make the difference between pushing more Republican or less Republican, or more Democrat or less Democrat on the day of the election. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And the same thing is true about Democrats, too. There's a solid bunch of people. There it is. No, back. Although there's a big variance here, but pretty much you can count on a good 30%, especially in the last 20 years, a good 30 to 33, 35% even, not quite 35, that are going to vote Democrat for sure, no matter what. But then there's the people who are on the bubble, who could go either way. And that's what everybody's fighting about right now in political ads. They're trying to find those people on the bubble. And if you get those to turn your way, because there's so many people who have already made up their mind, right? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, ma'am?
Yeah. And
I don't know that it's so much true today, but I have a feeling in the past it was, and that if there any statistical data, Democrat versus Republican based on religion.
State that question again, make sure I get it right.
Is there, I can say maybe not so much today, but in the past,
Yeah.
50 years ago, whatever, was there statistical data that would show the relationship to politics based on religion?
Yes. And the answer is yes. And this is a closely watched category. I get a almost daily newsletter from a guy named Ryan Burge, B-U-R-G-E. This guy is a political scientist, actually lives in Southern Illinois, who studies the relationship between religion and politics, among other things. But that's a key focus of his stuff. Like, people have been saying evangelicals are going to be 80% for Trump. There's always been, in years past, Catholics always had the reputation of being Democrat. That's changing. The pro-life issue is very much changing the dynamics for the Catholics and the Democratic Party there, because more and more Catholics are very pro-life, and thus that's going to change the way they vote. That one issue will change the way they vote. So, but those issues are watched in every election, and they try to get a meter to metrics to watch exactly how that's shifting and moving. But what's going to determine is some specific hot button issues that turn the religious vote one way or the other. And right now, all the attention is on, of course, the evangelicals and how they're going to go. Because there's a lot of evangelicals who aren't really hot about Trump. I'd still be very interested to see how this particular vote goes this year.
I just thought that 50 years ago that was more evident than it would be today of how people vote based on religion, but maybe not. I don't know.
Well, 50 years ago, you could have, and Jeff, you would help me on this, but 50 years ago, you would say that, yeah, Catholics are going to be a strong voting bloc for the Democratic Party. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Gary, would you? Yeah. But that's not so much true anymore. That's a big voting bloc, by the way.
Yeah.
A lot of Catholics. But now the evangelicals have become this massive voting bloc that people are watching very carefully. But probably, yeah, it's going to go 80% red, I think. Other questions, comments?
There's quite a difference in the black votes now that are predicting.
That's right. Used to think that blacks are going to be voting Democratic, but boy, that's not true anymore either. Maybe most of them will, but still, that number has been dwindling for a long time as well. You see many more Republican black voters now. You had a hand up over here.
Has the Daily Gazette always been Republican like the Telegraph?
Has the Daily Gazette always been Republican like the Telegraph? I think the answer is yes. Jeff, do you know about that?
I don't know for sure, but I would say not as strongly, probably. There's a strong Democratic populace in Whiteside County more than Lee County.
Anybody have any intelligence on that? Dee, did you know? Is Gazette Republican? You don't know. There wasn't very many sterling hands that were raised a little while ago. But now, of course, it's owned by the Telegraph. So
It's the same paper now.
It's what?
It's the same paper, they just changed the
Yeah.
headline.
It's changed headline. It's the same two people putting the paper together. That's true. Very true. Other comments, questions?
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
one thing to note on this graph that you have up here now, you look at the second Carter run, he dropped quite a bit, and that's probably due to the fact that John B. Anderson was a third-party candidate. It didn't look like it hurt Reagan at all, but it probably hurt Carter.
Yes.
And Carter was also primary by Ted Kennedy, if you recall.
Yes.
The other thing to note is in '92, Ross Perot was a third-party candidate. So in '96, Clinton did a lot better without the third party. So
Yeah.
that might have a little impact on.
Third party was still there in '96.
Yeah, there's the Ross Perot factor
Perot's
there.
still there.
The same.
Just
Yeah.
a little bit less.
Yeah, these third-party candidates, they really throw the election into a tizzy and changed the dynamics dramatically and really forced the candidates to re-engineer their entire campaign to try to figure out how to win something like that. If you know, Bill Clinton in 1992, here, this one, where there's this split ticket on the Republican side, my numbers may be wrong, but Bill Clinton won the election that year, and he only gained 43% of the vote. That sound right, Gary? Yeah. So he didn't get more than 50% of the vote, but yet because of the split ticket factor, 43% was enough to win.
And that compared with, to the electoral college.
Yeah, the
And
electoral
that's what
college is
really
where.
matters.
Yeah.
Popular vote does not count. The cumulative popular vote has never counted in this country. What counts is the electoral vote. That's what counts.
Yeah.
What I was going to say was observe was how popular another Illinoisan named Barack Obama was in this county. Look at that.
Yeah. The
He's right
Obama,
up there with
these are the Obama years, these two.
right up there with Johnson and Roosevelt.
Well, these two are Obama.
Yeah, I know.
These two.
What I'm saying is, look, it's the peak.
Yeah.
And we have two peaks there. And maybe it's certainly not because he was rural.
Yeah.
And Stevenson also had the Illinois factor, and it didn't work for him, but it did for Obama.
Big time.
Interesting.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah, Bill.
I was thinking this earlier when somebody asked a question, and we haven't brought this up at all. We talked about how the newspaper was hugely influential, and I can bring a perspective. I'm 50, so I started voting in about 96 there. Okay. And I noticed in about 1992, they start to switch a little bit, and that's right when the internet started getting really big. And we see the influence of, you can go on the internet and find whatever news you want. You ain't being fed it by your local newspaper. You can go on the internet and you can get whatever news you want, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And after that 92, 96 area, I mean, we do kind of see some changing there, where it's going more Democrat, or the Democrat numbers are going up and the Republican numbers are going down.
What you said cannot be overemphasized. It's so important. When I was covering the elections back here in the 80s, any political candidate knew they needed to pour a bunch of money into newspaper and radio and television, but mostly newspaper. But now you may not even see a political ad in the newspaper. It just doesn't have the impact.
Without a doubt, I think Obama was very charismatic and likable, and any video clip you saw back in that time frame, whether it be TV or internet or whatever, I mean, he knew how to, kind of like Reagan, he knew how to talk, he knew how to say what people like.
He's media savvy too. He knew how to use the social media. Social media is where it's at now. If you can manipulate that and pour money into that, I don't know about you, but my feed anymore, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook, I'm getting lots of stuff that I see from Trump or Harris promoting themselves. We're down to the wire. We need your money. If you got just $5, you're hearing that too. Yeah, that's going on right now. They're trying to get money for the last haul. Just one more question here.
1976, I went to a lecture by Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek.
Yeah.
And in there, he made a statement that always stuck with me. He said, worldwide communication would have more effect on our society than gunpowder.
I missed your last three words. Worldwide communication will have
more effect on our society than gunpowder.
Than gunpowder.
Right.
Whoa. I think that sounds right too, doesn't it? Worldwide communication. Wow. All right, one more. You go ahead.
I'll just join in here that I think we're going to see that with AI. It's just going to change our world, as we know it, artificial intelligence.
Can I disclose something? There were several questions I had as I was preparing this. All the numbers are hard numbers, but there were some questions I had like, how much does the parent affect the child's voting. I went to ChatGPT, AI, and I just asked it. Boom! I got an answer. And then I came back to it. I said, can you give me some specific studies that support what you just told me? Boom! It gave them right to me just like that. And I'm learning to go to AI to ask questions like that, but I always make sure that they've got studies and research and some sort of evidence to support what they're saying so that I can trust it. But it's an enormously beneficial tool if you know how to use it right. And I pray to God I'm using it right. Okay. Well, gang, it's time. I didn't think we'd go this long. I thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I hope this information was beneficial to you. Good night, guys.